we do have native beetles like the emerald ash borer that feed on native trees here,
Right.
but those native trees actually have evolved defenses
That's
to those
correct.
beetles. Is that correct?
Yeah, we have a number of what we call borer insects that get into ash. And the fact is, when people first started seeing that there were ashes declining, the first misdiagnoses that were occurring, let's say in 2003, or before 2002, when we actually discovered and identified the insect. Of course, people, when they first heard a story, oh, we have some ashes that are declining, and there's some borer holes in those ashes. Well, you can imagine that the initial thing to say was, well, borers on ash. There are a lot of native borers, and typically those native borers that have kind of co-evolved, they are a problem, but they tend to come into already stressed trees that were declining from major droughts, trees that were declining because they were being serious competition with other trees, all kinds of different things in the forest and in our urban forest. So, initially we thought, the initial reports were, that this must be another one of these native ash borers that are coming in on unhealthy plants, kind of culling the herd kind of deal. Eventually we realized, wait a minute, something different is happening here. These are healthy trees. These were trees that were completely healthy that are suddenly succumbing to this insect. And then we started to look carefully at the exit holes of this insect as they emerged from the tree, and they left very characteristic D-shaped holes. And these D-shaped holes told us, ooh, this is not any of our native ashes. They aren't clear-wing borers. They aren't ash lilac borers. These are not the things that we would typically expect to see on stressed ashes. And then they put that together and started to look much more carefully. And then we realized, oops, we have this invasive species that now we have plants that have no genetic mechanisms that have evolved in response to this challenge from a new insect.
Okay, so we have a non-native insect that's coming into a new population,
Right.
that we have no defense mechanisms to it,
Right.
and the outlook is very grim.
The outlook is very grim. I mean, obviously in geologic time, we could say, well, in a couple million years or so, or maybe even a couple thousand years or so, they'll cull out all the plants. There will be some mutations occurring in our North American fraxinus, and we'll eventually learn that there is some resistance. And so, if you waited long enough, perhaps you would find that we would have genetic resistance that would develop, just like it must have developed in Asia. But obviously, on the human time scale, we don't want to have that kind of thing develop.
Yeah, most people like to see a tree come to maturity in their lifetime and preserve that tree.
And that's right. So you have to look at different strategies.
Okay. Now, I just was talking with some folks in urban forestry in the Twin Cities, and I know that several inventories have been done.
Right.
Where the street tree populations, which are the trees that communities are responsible for, usually along roads and right-of-ways, that in some communities over 40% of the street trees are ash trees.
Right.
Is that something that you've had to deal with in Ohio, as well as just this magnitude of
40%,
trees?
40% is a lot. We typically, and I think it should be even lower than this, typically we would not want to see more than 10% of a particular species in a population in a community forest. Now, a tree species would be, for example, Fraxinus nigra, the black ash. That's a species in the genus Fraxinus. So there are different species, of course, then. There are other species like the green ash and the white ash in the genus Fraxinus as well. We wouldn't like to see more than 10% of one species. So we don't want to see 40% of a species, and we certainly, and so maybe 20% at the most, although it probably should be lower, of even a single genus in one single community or one single forested area. And the idea behind that, again, is we want some diversity. So when you're getting up to 40%, and frankly, in my mind, even if you're getting up to 20%, we have a lot of communities in Ohio with 20%, and in some cases more than that, you're putting too many eggs in one basket. We don't like what we call monoculture. It's the same issue that we should have addressed before we saw the Dutch elm disease. I mean, the real problem in a lot of communities with these wonderful tunnels of overarching branches of elms was we had all American elms, Ulmus americana, a monoculture of them. And so when something arrived, again, an invasive species, in that case a fungus, we had devastating wipeouts of whole urban forests because everything was elm. So we really don't like to have too many eggs in one basket just in case of what just happened. An invasive species arrives, we'd like to have more genetic diversity. So certainly we would like to see the genus Fraxinus less than 20% in a community before all this happened. Well, now that it's happened, you know, we're going to have to look at some alternatives. Over time, I mean, there are insecticides that can help with this disease, this insect on a individual tree basis, but it's not going to be the sort of thing where all the ashes of Minnesota can be treated. So it's got to be coordinated into an effort to, okay, let's buy some time, perhaps, in terms of let's try to rebuild our urban forest with the idea that ashes are probably going to be ultimately removed from that urban forest unless we're willing to make insecticide applications in perpetuity, as far as we know, to help control the problem on that particular individual tree. So we're going to have to rebuild that forest. Maybe we can buy some time with some selected areas where we apply insecticides and start rebuilding with other species. But again, important message to remember from this and from the Dutch elm disease: don't rebuild with 40% of a single genus. Don't rebuild with 30% of a single genus. Make sure we have diversity in our replantings, and let's try to buy ourselves some time with some approaches that we can use to help manage this pest.
Okay, from a human lifespan
Right.
scenario, I have a house and I have a 25-inch large, big ash tree in my front yard.
Right.
It would cost a large amount of money to remove it.
Right.
So I want to invest, at least in my lifetime,
Right.
to protect that tree. There are options to do that for individual trees?
There are options to do that for individual trees, and that's why, you know, at Ohio State University and at the University of Minnesota, sometimes people ask, well, what is your policy on whether we should treat or not treat? Now, there really is no single policy because it really depends on your objectives. You may have a situation where you really want to protect an important tree. Maybe you want to protect it for 5 years, 10 years, 1 year. I mean, that's really up to you. And the reality of it is that you have the option of making insecticide applications, but you're probably going to have to make them every year or maybe every 2 to 3 years, depending upon where we get with fungicide chemistry and the ability to control them over a period of time. But you have to realize that's a cost. Now, the fact is there's other costs. I mean, one of the things that the Why Trees Matter initiative that you and I are involved in is understanding that there are environmental services of trees. What did you say the size of that ash was in terms of diameter?
About 25.
So you have a 25, 26 inch diameter at breast height ash tree in your yard. We know now from really good, well-researched models using the iTree public software, we know that probably for a 26-inch green ash, that probably the environmental services that tree provides on an annual basis, I'm just guessing here a little bit, but maybe around $150. $150 of environmental services: stormwater remediation, energy savings, air quality benefits, aesthetic benefits, value of your home, all those different kind of things put in about $150 per year value of that tree. So you have to balance that against the cost of making insecticide applications, but also how important it is for your landscape, how important it is to your sense of your home. You know, Dan Herms, who is a wonderful entomologist in Ohio, and of course was your graduate advisor when you got your PhD, John, you know, had some interesting issues. He had a cabin up in Minnesota, and he kind of looked at it this way. He lived in the middle of a forest, in his home there. And he decided that, well, in the forested area, hundreds, thousands of ashes nearby and around his property, nature was just going to have to take its course. He didn't really have an option to do much, so really, ultimately, there may be some issues he has relative to what will I try to replant in certain sites, but he can't really do anything about those. He then said, well, okay, but what about the ashes around my cabin, the ones that really give it its character? Well, I want to save some of those, and so I'm going to treat with insecticide. And then he did decide some of those trees around his house that they were important, but you know, they were just getting bigger every year, getting more and more expensive to remove every year, because as it grows bigger, it's going to get more expensive to remove. He cut some of those down and turned them into furniture for his cabin, so ash furniture. So there's lots of different ways to look at this issue. There's no single answer about what any one individual should do, and communities also take different approaches. I think one of the things that is interesting as the dialogue develops, and something we found in Ohio, the public education campaign is really critical. Because people come at this issue in different ways the more they learn about it. One of the approaches that a number of urban forestry groups in Ohio and communities came at it was, we want to kind of amortize our risk. I mean, as tree people, we hate to think of a tree as a risk. We always are looking at the benefits of trees, but there's a negative on the other end of that in some situation like this, where you can't leave dead trees to fall on people in the streets. So some communities decided that, look, we know we have 20% of ashes, and we know that we believe that we're not really literally going to be able to save these ashes, except in a few cases where we're going to spend the money to do that. So we know that we're going to have to remove them. Well, removal of trees is costly, but we have to do it. Well, where does the tax money come to do that? And they decided in many of these communities, let's amortize our risk by removing a certain percentage every year over a certain number of years, knowing that they're not. Because oftentimes when it comes into a community, it can move pretty fast, and trees can die within 3 years of infestation, 2 years of infestation, and a lot of them at once. So they decided to cut some of the trees down each year in a planned approach. Well, some people thought that was the most horrible thing possible. Those trees aren't dead yet. They're not dying yet. Why are you cutting down what are still, at this moment, healthy trees? The argument was, look, we're not going to be able to pass a tax levy to cut down all these trees and remove all these trees in a single year. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to have to divert money from the police and the fire departments to make that one big giant, if we can't get this passed. They wanted to responsibly try to take another approach to look at some planning over time. And planning is critical for Minnesota communities. What are you going to do when you do with your removals? Where are they going to be put? How are you going to deal with that material so that they aren't places that the emerald ash borer spreads from? Are you going to chip them? Are you going to turn it into mulch? What are you going to utilize the wood for? I mean, after all, the wood is usable. What are you going to utilize that wood for? So those plans for utilization, and oftentimes this has to be region-wide. So a lot of political working together of communities regionally is going to be an important piece of the puzzle, and then really thinking out the management plan.
So really, there's these municipalities in Minnesota, it's inevitable that it's going to happen. And it really requires a long-term perspective, or at least planning, knowing what ash trees you have, which ones you want to protect, and which ones you can remove in a steady stream.
Right.
Is really the best way to tackle this as far as Ohio communities are concerned.
Oh, exactly. And Minnesota, well known for the tremendous resource of urban forestry expertise. I mean, you have tremendous programs in many of the communities in Minnesota, and they're on top of a lot of these things. But of course, more and more of that cooperation between communities has to happen for this to really work on a regional-wide basis. So yes, knowing how many trees you have in your community and where they are, and which ones of them are ash, I mean, that's a logistically important thing, not only for this issue, but whenever there's other issues, and whenever you have needs for pruning, and whenever you have desires to increase, let's say you wanted to increase your urban canopy coverage, because how much that matters relative to carbon sequestration, energy savings when those trees are near buildings, all those kind of things. You need to have that baseline data from inventories, for example. So basic inventories are something that some communities have and others don't. It's important to know that, to know not only what your resource is, but what your risk is.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim Chatfield from the Ohio State University. Thank you for being on Why Trees Matter. And again, we appreciate you flying all the way out from Ohio to join us today.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, thank you. That's it for Why Trees Matter. Next week, we'll actually bring in two city foresters, one from the city of Minneapolis and one from the city of Minnetonka, to talk about what they are doing to plan and manage for emerald ash borer. Thank you. Why Trees Matter is brought to you by the Urban Forestry Institute. Our sponsor today was Rainbow Tree Care Companies, Science, Service, and Satisfaction. Our speaker was provided by the Ohio State University Extension.